Okay, so good afternoon. Thank you for joining us via the Zoom today for our continued study of Sefer Yehoshua. Today we're going to do chapter 22, Perek Kaf Bet. And chapter 22 is, as a quick summary, is going to be Yehoshua sending home after the conquest and the settlement of the land of Israel, sending home the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half of Menashe, to go home to their territory on the eastern side of the Jordan River. And there's an interesting saga, an interesting situation that happens upon their return, which we'll get to when we take a look at our chapter, Yehoshua Perek Kaf Bet, Yehoshua chapter 22, in a little bit more depth. But to really understand what Yehoshua is doing here in chapter 22, we have to take a look back into the Torah, as we've done so often in our study of Sefer Yehoshua, which is so closely linked to Moshe's life and the life of the Jewish people in the Torah. We have to take a look back at Sefer Bamidbar, chapter 32, Perek Lamed Bet, to kind of refresh our memories about the agreement between Reuven, Gad, and Menashe as to when they were able to go back home and when they were going to, what they were going to do and what they were going to accomplish. Did they fulfill their obligations towards the Jewish people? And we'll notice a couple of interesting points in that chapter in a little bit more nuanced of a way that will relate to our chapter here in Yehoshua 22. So very quickly, you'll see on the screen in front of you, I have Numbers 32, that's Sefer Bamidbar, chapter 32. I like to skim through chapter 32 of Numbers so that we can get just a sense, a flavor of what we're talking about, which will help us to understand Yehoshua chapter 22. So the Bamidbar chapter 32 takes place after the Jewish people conquered the lands of Sihon and Og. The Jewish people fought two massive battles against two of the more powerful nations in the region at that time, against Sihon Melech HaEmori and Og Melech HaBashan. These were the protectors of the entranceway into Canaan, and the Jewish people disposed of them with ease and with strength with the help of Hashem. And after they conquered these territories, the tribes of Reuven and Gad approach Moshe Rabbeinu. And they say, Mikneh Rav haya leReuven veLivnei Gad atzu me'od. The tribes of Reuven and Gad had a lot of cattle, and they saw all of these areas, the areas of Sihon and Og, as very fertile, very lush areas for cattle. And so what do? They come to Moshe Rabbeinu. Vayavo bnei Gad uvnei Reuven. The children of Gad and Reuven come to Moshe. Notice how, by the way, they're always interchangeable. Sometimes Gad is before Reuven, sometimes Reuven is before Gad, to teach us that they equally bought into this plan. It was not one tribe more than the other who was the driving force behind this plan. They equally drove the plan together. And they say to Moshe Rabbeinu, look at all these lands, Atarot, Divon, Yazer, Virimra, all these beautiful cities that we just conquered. Haaretz asher hika Adonai lifnei adat Yisrael, the land that Hashem has smitten and conquered from in front of the congregation of the Jewish people. Eretz Miknehi, it's a land of lush greenery, and a perfect land for people who have cattle. Vela avadecha mikneh, and to your servants, us, more than any of the other tribes, we have a lot of cattle. Now, they don't really express what their request is. They just kind of say, look, this land is great for cattle, and we have a lot of cattle. Wink, wink, Moshe. But Moshe doesn't respond to them. Look at verse 5. You'll notice that there's a chapter break over here. And then verse 5, it says, Vayomeru. They continued to say, so there was no change in speaker. Moshe didn't say anything there, but the Torah continues, Vayomeru. They further said, Im matzanu chen be'enecha, if we found favor in your eyes, Yutan et haaretz hazot la'avadecha la'achuzah. Please give us this land as our inheritance. Al ta'avirenu et hayarden. Do not take us over the Jordan River. So you notice over here that the tribes themselves, Reuven and Gad, when they first asked Moshe to live on the other side of the Jordan River, they were hesitant. They kind of said it in like a secretive, kind of inconspicuous way, like wink, wink, Moshe, this land is good for us. But they never actually expressed their desire to be there and to not go to the land of Israel until Moshe really didn't respond to them. Moshe was kind of like, what do you want from me? And that doesn't get recorded in the Torah. I'm just kind of, putting it in there. But in Pasuk 5, in Pasuk Hey, that's when they finally give over after Moshe doesn't really respond to them. And there's a hesitation there. They're finally transparent. They say, Moshe, we want this land. Please give it to us. Don't let us go over. And once they say that, Moshe Rabbeinu launches into a tirade against the tribes of Gad and Reuven. And he has two major points. In verse 6, he says, Vayomer Moshe livnei Gad v'livnei Reuven. Moshe says to the children of Gad and Reuven, will your brothers go to war, and you're going to stay here in the lap of luxury? You're not going to fight with the people? Number one, it's not fair that you should not have to fight. No, number two, he says in verse 7, why are you going to sway the hearts of the Jewish people from crossing over the Jordan River into the land of Israel? To inhabit the land that God has given them. And Moshe then proceeds to remind them of the terrible sin of the spies and what they did wrong and how they rejected the land and all of the suffering that they've gone through during the 40 years in the desert and the people dying was all because of exactly what they're doing right now, asking and requesting not to go to the land of Eretz Yisrael. Moshe assumes that the worst about their intentions. He assumes that they're trying to get out of something. He says it's not fair, and Moshe is obviously not happy. He's clearly upset at this request. He's clearly distraught by the asking of Reuven and Gad to not go to the land of Israel. And let's not forget that at this point, Moshe knows that he's not going to the land of Israel. So you could put yourself in Moshe's shoes. Moshe is desperate to go to the land of Israel. He's beseeching God constantly to go to the land of Israel. His major punishment is that he won't finish out his major duty. Here are a group of people saying, we don't want to go to the land of Israel. Moshe can't fathom it. How could it be that people don't want to go to the land of Israel when that's my whole being, my whole purpose, everything I stand for, Moshe says, is I want to go to the land of Israel. So there's clearly a disconnect here between Reuven and Gad and Moshe. There's something that's not bringing them together. And that's why Moshe doesn't really understand where they're coming from at first and assumes the worst about them. If we skip down a little bit, after Moshe's long discussion to them about the sin of the spies, and you can see here in verse 14, he says, V'hineh kamtem tahat avotechem. Now you, a breed of sinful people, came on out from your brothers, right? Tarbut anashim hataim, and you replaced your fathers with this terrible culture to continue to arouse the wrath of God. So Moshe is clearly not happy. Reuven and God say, hold it, Moshe. I think you jumped to conclusions. We're not looking to get out of something. We're not looking not to fight. We don't not like the land of Israel. We're going to go first and foremost. We're going to lead the vanguard into the land of Israel. We're going to fight with our brothers. We're not only going to fight, but we're going to lead the way. So don't worry about that. We're certainly not looking for a way out as far as battle is concerned. As far as the land is concerned, it's not that we don't like the land of Eretz Yisrael. It's not that we're against it. It's that we find that this land, the land of the Transjordan, the east of the Jordan River, is more suitable for our needs. Our needs are material. We have a lot of cattle. We need to take care of our businesses. And, this land makes sense for us. We're certainly not strangers to Jewish people saying that we don't want to go to Israel because of business reasons, right? This is something that I think all of us, fortunately or unfortunately, can identify with the plight of Reuven and Gad. Many of us would say we don't live in Israel because it's hard to make a living over there, right? So we can understand where the Reuven and Gad are certainly coming from. Moshe has trouble understanding it, but eventually Moshe Rabbeinu comes on board. Excuse me, Moshe in verse 20 says, Vayomer alehem Moshe says to them, okay, im ta'asun et hadavar hazeh, if you agree to your stipulations, number one, that you're going to lead the battle of the Jewish people, and number two, that you are not looking to separate yourself from the Jewish people and to reject the land of Eretz Yisrael, so then we will accept your bargain. We'll accept your contract, what it is that you want to say, and you have to make sure to fulfill your word. But if you don't, then you lose your portion in the land of the Transjordan, and you'll have to come into Eretz Yisrael. Okay? And that's the deal that Reuven and Gad strike with Moshe. They then present that deal to the rest of the Jewish people, and it's agreed upon. It's agreed upon, and it's settled that that's what's going to happen to the tribes of Reuven and Gad. If you recall, in the early goings of our study of Sefer Yehoshua, we saw this come to fruition in chapter 3, early on, when the Jewish people first get into the land of Israel. Yehoshua reminds the tribes of Reuven and Gad that they have a responsibility to come first and foremost into the land and to lead the way in battle, and they do so. So this is the background. This is what happened. This is chapter Numbers, Bamidbar, chapter 32. The deal between Moshe and Reuven and Gad. We saw that Yehoshua pushed the agenda, And now, after all is said and done, after we've studied about the conquest, after we've studied about the settlement of the land, Yehoshua in chapter 22 is ready to send Reuben and Gad home. And now that we have this background, we'll be able to notice some of the very specific things that go on in this chapter and hopefully bring out a number of important lessons related to chapter 22. So I'll pause here for a minute if anybody has any questions about the background that we did of Numbers chapter 32, of the deal between Reuben and Gad. Now is a good time to ask about it before we continue into our chapter and how that plays a role in our book. Okay, very good. So it looks like we're ready now to take a look at our chapter, Yehoshua, chapter 22. Let's see it inside. Let's read a little bit of the beginning of the story, just to see. I think the first lesson is the honesty with which Yehoshua conducts himself and the tribes of Reuben and Gad conduct themselves, and what it means to really fulfill your promise. Az yikra Yehoshua laReubeni veLagadi veLachatzi mate Menashe. Then Yehoshua called to the tribes of Reuben and Gad and half of the tribe of Menashe. We'll get back to the half tribe of Menashe, an idea that we mentioned elsewhere in other classes, but that we want to solidify here today as well. Pasuk bet, Vayomer anehim, Yehoshua said to the tribes, Atem shemartem, you kept your word. Et kol asher tziva etchem Moshe eved Adonai. Everything that Moshe had stipulated with you. Vatishme'u bekoli, and you listened to my voice, even though it wasn't Moshe. You continued to obey your promise to me as well. Lechol asher tziviti etchem, and to everything that I commanded you. Like we pointed out earlier, the tribes of Reuben and Gad could have said to Yehoshua, hey, we didn't make this deal with you. We made this deal with Moshe. Although they knew at the time that Moshe wasn't going to the land of Israel. But they chose to abide by it with Yehoshua. They chose to listen to Yehoshua, and they followed Yehoshua's lead, despite the fact that they made the deal originally with Moshe. And Yehoshua was actually not a part. You can notice from the Pesukim that we read, Yehoshua was noticeably absent in Bamidbar chapter 32. He makes the deal with, Reuben and Gad make the deal with Moshe, Elazar. They don't make it with Yehoshua, and yet they still followed Yehoshua's lead. Verse 3, Pasuk Gimal, Lo azavtem et achechem, you did not abandon your brothers, Ze yamim rabim, for many days. Remember, it was 14 years of conquest and settlement that the tribes of Reuben and Gad were away from their families and their home. Not a small amount of time, not a small sacrifice. Ad hayom hazeh, to this point, ushmartem et mishmeret mitzvat Adonai Elohechem, and you guarded the keepsake of the command of the Lord your God. Verse 4, Ve'ata hiniach Adonai Elohechem la'achechem, but now God has given the land to your brothers, ka'asher diber lahem, as God had promised to them, and so therefore you're off the hook. Ve'ata penu ulchu lachem le'aholechem, you may now turn around and go back to your tents. El eretz achuzatchem, to the land of your inheritance, asher natan lachem Moshe eved Adonai be'eved hayarden, to the land that Moshe, the servant of God, gave to you on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Now you can notice here, I don't want to say that Yehoshua was condescending in what he said to Reuben and Gad, but you could certainly notice a clear contrast in Yehoshua's words to the tribes of Reuben and Gad. You fulfilled your mission, and you helped us get the land that God promised us. So now you can turn and go back to the land that Moshe gave you. You see a clear distinction there, right? There's the land that God gave us. It's a God-given land of Eretz Yisrael, and that's the land you guys rejected. And you go home to the land that Moshe gave you. Now, the land that Moshe gave them is important. It's Moshe Eved Hashem, but you notice the difference, right? This is the land that God promised us and Diber Lahem versus the land that Moshe allowed you to stay at. Those are two very different things, the way Yehoshua paints the picture. So again, I don't want to say he was being condescending to them or critical of them, but it's just the facts. The facts are that Reuben and Gad chose to live in a land outside of Eretz Yisrael. And Yehoshua does not leave that point out. He makes sure to reiterate it. And now he says to them, look, there's a fear. You're about to go back home outside of the land of Israel. You're going to separate from the rest of the Jewish people who you've been in close contact with for these many years. Yehoshua tells them in verse 5 in Pasuk Hey, Rak shimru me'od, make sure that you very diligently keep לעשות את המצווה ואת התורה אשר ציווה אתכם משה עבד אדוני, to keep the laws and the commandments and the Torah which Moshe, the servant of God, commanded you. Le'ahava et Adonai Elohechem, to love the Lord your God, ve'lalechet b'chol derachav, and to walk in all of his ways, ve'lishmor mitzvotav, and to keep his mitzvot, to guard them, u'ledofka bo, and to cling to him, u'le'ovdo b'chol levavchem u'b'chol nafshechem, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. We hear a lot of the words of Shema presented here by Yehoshua to the people, right? These are famous phrases that we read every single day about love of God, fear of God, commitment to the mitzvot, clinging to God, and serving God. These are all things that Yehoshua says that the tribes, when they go back, there's a concern that they might not keep these. And so he inspires them, he motivates them, and he strengthens them towards this endeavor. And verse 6 wraps up this little section. Vayvarechem Yehoshua, Yehoshua blessed them, Vayshallechem, and he sent them, Vayelechu et aholehem, and they went back to their tents. Now, that's a nice way to cap it. He sends them back home. Now, I mentioned to you that we were going to go to the tribe of Menashe. The tribe of Menashe is an interesting one because, as we've pointed out in the past, but it's worth reiterating, the tribe of Menashe was not in the original deal with Moshe. Originally, the tribes of Reuben and Gad, just two tribes, approached Moshe to stay on the eastern side of the Jordan River. And then all of a sudden, the tribe of Menashe, and only half of them, are thrown into the mix with Reuben and Gad. And it's not clear why that happens, right? And you can notice over here, our chapter makes a point of it as well. If you look at verses 7 and 8, Velachatzi shevet ha-Menashe, and to half of the tribe of Menashe, Natan Moshe b'Bashan. Moshe placed them in the Bashan. It almost sounds like from our text that he did this intentionally, that Moshe Rabbeinu added the half tribe of Menashe for a very specific reason. And we'll have to say what that reason is. Velechetzion natan Yehoshua im achayim. And to the other half, Yehoshua gave to be with their brothers, be'ever hayarden yama. Vegam ki shelecham Yehoshua el ahonehem vayvarechem. And so too Yehoshua sent them back to their tents, and he blessed them as well. So there's an isolation over here of the tribe of Menashe. The tribe of Menashe is considered separately from the tribes of Reuben and Gad, and that's for a very specific reason. Some, such as the Ramban, suggest that it wasn't that Moshe intentionally did it, but that the tribes of Menashe, so to speak, when they heard about what was going on with Reuben and Gad, they wanted to expand their boundaries. They had a large people, and so they made sort of a decision, or that Moshe, sort of threw on them. He saw that they were there, so he added them. But I think that a better explanation is that Moshe made an intentional point of putting the tribe of Menashe split between the two sections. That he took half of them and put them on one side of the Jordan, and the other half he kept on in the land of Eretz Israel. And he threw that in order to keep the bonds between those who were on the opposite side of the Jordan and those who were in the land of Eretz Israel together. And there's no guarantee that the tribes of Reuben and Gad on their own would keep a connection with the rest of the Jewish people on the other side of the Jordan in the land of Israel. In fact, it seems quite clear that, as we'll see from the way the chapter continues, that it's obvious that they're going to have trouble keeping that connection, and that Yehoshua is concerned about it, and the tribes themselves are concerned about it. And so perhaps Moshe tried to remedy that situation by taking a tribe, one that loves Eretz Yisrael and has a connection, a very large tribe, and separating it into two, putting half on one side and half on the other side, with the hopes that those two halves will constantly interact with each other, would connect with each other. And as a result, all of those who were on the eastern side of the Jordan River would connect with those who are inside the Jordan River. On the opposite side of the Jordan in the land of Israel. So that was Moshe Rabbeinu's sort of, maybe his plot, maybe his intention when he was doing all of this. Like I said, the Ramban says it was more accidental, more haphazard. I think from what we're seeing here in the text, we can maybe argue that it was even intentional on the part of Moshe Rabbeinu. And it makes sense. And we'll see it makes even more sense when you consider the actions of Reuven and Gad and the half tribe of Menashe themselves, when they start to get nervous about themselves going back to their home outside of the land of Eretz Yisrael. So let's keep that in the back of our minds when we think about the tribe of Menashe. We see they have a clear, unique place. And let's continue pushing through chapter 22 over here. And now we get to the drama. Now the drama unfolds. The tribes of Reuven, Gad, and half of Menashe are returning home, and they do something very, very interesting that causes a stir amongst the Jewish people. Let's read verses 9 through 12. Vayashuvu vayelchu bnei Reuven uvnei Gad v'chatzi shevet Menashe. They returned and they went, the children of Reuven and Gad and half the tribe of Menashe. Me'et b'nei Israel, they left from amongst their other Jewish brothers. Mishilo, they left from Shiloh. That was where the Mishkan was. Asher be'eretz Canaan. So notice the text is telling you they left the center, they left the epicenter of holiness within the camp of the Jewish people. Lalechet el eretz hagilad, to go to the land of Gilad, which really has nothing unique about it as far as spirituality is concerned. El eretz achuzatam asher nochazuba, to the land of their ancestral portion that they grabbed onto. Al pi Adonai biyad Moshe, at the mouth of God with the hand of Moshe. Moshe gave it to them with God's acquiescence. Pasuk Yod vayavo el Gelilot hayarden. They came to the region right at about the Jordan River, asher be'eretz Canaan, which is right at the edge of the land of Canaan. And they do something fascinating. Vayivnu bnei Reuben ubnei Gad v'chatzi shevet Menashe sham mizbeach. Reuben, Gad, and half of Menashe, they build an altar. Al hayarden, on the Jordan. Mizbeach gadol, a large altar limar'eh, which can be seen as far as the eye can see. Now, that's going to cause a stir. And it does. Pasuk 11, Yud Aleph, Vayishme'u b'nei Yisrael emo. The rest of the Jewish people heard and started spreading the word. The children of Reuven, Gad, and half of Menashe, they built an altar. Did you guys hear what happened? And it's like no sooner do they leave, and Yehoshua is concerned, and everybody's concerned, and you're going to have to separate, immediately something happens. A red flag goes up. They don't even wait. There's no time. Immediately a red flag goes up. And we'll come back to that point. Maybe it's even that fact that it was so immediate, which hoped that Reuven and Gad, it was what brought Reuven and Gad to maybe hope that they wouldn't look at this act as a negative, right? But no sooner do they go, they build an altar, and it freaks out the rest of the Jewish people. El mul eretz Canaan el Gelilot hayarden el ever b'nei Israel. Vayishme'u b'nei Israel, the entire Jewish people here. Vayikahalu kol adat b'nei Israel. They gather the entire tribe of the Jewish people, Shiloh, at the epicenter. La'alot alehem latzava. And they're talking about, going to war. They're going to take the armies and they're going to go fight Reuven and Gad. Now the question is, what did they see in this altar? Why was this altar a red flag for the rest of the Jewish people? Any takers before we read the Pesukim?
Didn't they say that there's not allowed to have private sacrifice within the land of Israel?
Excellent. Very good, Esther, right? So we documented earlier that when they moved the Mishkan to Shiloh, and this is why I went through that at the time, that the bamot, the private altars, became prohibited. And anybody who was giving a sacrifice on a private altar, it was tantamount to avodah zarah, right? You were committing idolatry, because all of the sacrifices had to be done in the center of the Jewish people, which at that time was in the Mishkan in Shiloh, right? And so this act of building a gigantic, massive altar was interpreted, and not surprisingly by the rest of the Jewish people, as an attempt to subvert the centrality of the Mishkan at Shiloh, and that the tribes on the other side of the Jordan River would not need to go to Eretz Yisrael, to the Mishkan, whether it be on the festivals, whether it be to give a sacrifice. They wouldn't need to go, and they would be able to worship God or whatever other God, whatever idolatrous practices they wanted to do on their own. Now, if you think for a minute that this is an overreaction on the part of the Jewish people, fast forward a few hundred years, maybe more than that, and when the kingdom of Judaism, the kingdom of the Jewish people splits, when the kingdom in Eretz Yisrael splits into two kingdoms, Malchut Yehuda and Malchut Yisrael, and the kingdom of Yehuda is 2 tribes with the Beit HaMikdash, and the kingdom of Yisrael is 10 tribes without the Beit HaMikdash. The kingdom of Israel does not say, oh, okay, we don't have the Beit HaMikdash, we got to go to the kingdom of Judah to go to the Beit HaMikdash. That's not what they say. The king Yarovam says, no, we're going to build our own Beit HaMikdash. We're going to build our own altar. We're going to build our own place to worship God, and the heck with these people, right? So this is something that's in our blood. I mean, that happens in the future, but you can understand why the Jewish people at that time see this as a rebellion against the centrality of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. This is a split off of the kingdom, and that's the way they take it right away. I mean, the immediacy of it maybe should have called them into saying, hold it, guys, they did this really quick. It's probably something else. But that's not what the Jewish people think to themselves. The Jewish people get very nervous, and the tension was already high There's no doubt that Yehoshua knew the risks of sending them home and what was going to happen. And so for this to happen right away, it's no wonder that they think about it. So take a look at verse 13. We'll read a couple of these verses together as well. וישלחו בני ישראל את בני ראובן ואל בני גד ואל חצי שבט מנשה אל ארץ הגלעד. So the Jewish people take a moment, and this is really something. I'm going to point out that Al-Bag, Gersonides, Rabbi Levi ben Gershom, mentions a point here which I think is a very important lesson. The Jewish people send a council. So they're thinking about attacking. They're thinking about waging war very impulsively. They decide to take a step back, and they send a cohort, I should say, to the tribe of Reuben, Gad, and half of Menashe. Who do they send? They send Pinchas and Elazar HaKohen. Elazar HaKohen is the high priest. Pinchas is a very significant character whom we know already from our time in the desert. And it's ironic that they should send Pinchas, because Pinchas is in his nature a zealot. Just to give us a little bit of background about Pinchas, Pinchas was the man who killed a Jewish man in front of everybody publicly when he was committing an act of adultery to the eyes of the Jewish people. If you go back to the time right after Bilam, when they sent the daughters of Midian and Moab, this is in Sefer Bamidbar as well. It's at the end of Parashat Balak, right before you get to Parashat Pinchas. It says that Bilam gave an advice to Balak to send the daughters so that the Jewish people will be promiscuous. They act promiscuously, and a plague breaks out. And one of the leading tribes, the tribe of Shimon, which we talked about when we talked about the land that Shimon got and what they did to deserve losing their portion of land in the desert. Pinchas takes a spear and kills the woman and man who are engaging in a promiscuous act in front of the entire Jewish people. He doesn't even ask Moshe what to do about it. Moshe's standing there. Moshe doesn't say anything. Pinchas takes a spear and savagely kills these two people in one shot in the public eye. Pinchas is a zealot. He's not somebody who asks questions, at least not when the honor of God is on the line. Typically, zealots, they act first and they ask questions later, right? What do they say? Shoot first, question later. That's the kind of person that Pinchas is. And so it's ironic or interesting, or maybe the perfect idea that the text is trying to tell us, that they sent Pinchas. So, in other words, they sent someone who by his nature was zealous, but Pinchas takes a different approach here. Pinchas is saying there's a time for zealotry and there's a time not to have that. And Pinchas is able to compartmentalize that. I think it's a very telling thing about Pinchas and about the Jewish people as a whole. Pinchas knows when the time is to be zealous, and now he knows it's the time for investigation, for deliberation. And the Jewish people send him knowing that Pinchas is that type of character. So they send a delegation to the tribes of Reuben and Gad and half of Menashe to determine what's going on over here. Verse 14, they send them together with other Nisi'im. We'll skip down to verse 16. They come and they say to the tribes of Reuben and Gad, Ko amru kol adat Adonai. Such is what's said from the congregation of God. What is this act which you have committed, a rebellious act against the Lord, the God of Israel? Lashuv hayom me'achare Adonai, to return today and to go and rebel against the ways of God. Bivnotechem lachem mizbeach, by building for yourselves an altar. Limrodchem hayom b'Adonai, to rebel against God. Hama'at lanu et avon peor. Is it enough? Isn't it enough? The sin that we did at Peor, the sin at Peor is the sin we just talked about. The sin of cohabiting with the daughters of Moab and Midian publicly. It's the sin that Pinchas has in his mind. That's why he's talking about it. He says, was it not enough what we experienced at Peor, that one person did an act and it brought about terrible consequences for the rest of the Jewish people? The reason why he singles this one out, A, is because it's definitely on Pinchas's mind, but because it's the paradigmatic case where one group of people does something wrong and it causes a plague and destruction, devastation to the entire Jewish people. As we noted before, it was really the tribe of Shimon who engaged in these promiscuous acts way back when in the desert, right after Bilam tries to curse the Jewish people. And as a result, a magefa, a plague breaks out that kills 24,000 people, most from the tribe of Shimon, but not limited to them as well. And it brings negativity to the entire Jewish people. And so Pinchas is saying Do we not learn the lessons over here? Did we not learn that one tribe or two tribes can bring tremendous consequences, negative consequences on the entire Jewish people? Asher lo hitaharnu mimenu. We've yet to purify ourselves from this sin. Ad hayom hazeh, until this day. Vahi hanegef ba'adat Adonai. And the after effects of this are still being felt. The plague is still being felt. Our lack of numbers as a Jewish people is still being felt. We're still trying to recover those 24,000 people who perished. And yet, verse 18, and you're going to turn away from the path of God. You know what's going to happen? Today, it's a rebellion against God, just you guys. Tomorrow, it could be more people. And next thing you know, the whole Jewish people are getting punished because of God, because of you guys, and from God. What's going on over here? Now, maybe this is their way. Maybe this is a plea on the part of Reuben and Gad to try to get out of their contract to take the eastern side of the Jordan River. They say, if your land is unclean, in other words, if you're not interested in it anymore, then just come and live with us. In other words, if you're acting out, it's like when you see a child acting out because the child doesn't like the class or wants to move classes or something like that. We're seeing this tribe act out. If you guys are having second thoughts, if you're acting out now because you want us to bring you back in, fine. You can come back in. They give them a second chance. Just pass back to Achuzat Hashem Asher Shachan Sham Mishkan Adonai ve'ha'achazu b'tochenu and come take land from within us. They actually give them an opportunity to renege on their original discussion with Moshe way back when in Numbers chapter 32. And they say, you can come live with us if you want. But ubadonai al timrodu. Don't rebel against God. That's the most important thing. Ve'otanu al timrodu. And don't rebel against us. Bivnotechem lachem mizbeach, by building an altar. Which is separate from the altar of the Lord our God. There's no room for two altars. There's no room for two kingdoms. There's no room for two different ways of life. It's one or the other. And so if you guys are unhappy, if your land is tameh, you're not interested, you want to come back, come back. It's open for you guys to come back. If not, then this has to end. And then they bring up on one last point in verse 20. Remember what happened when one guy, Achan, all the way back in chapter 2, when he took from the Herem, when he took from the spoils of war. That's not chapter 2, it was maybe chapter 6 or something when they fought against Yericho, right? This is why you got to do chazara, you got to review. But when Achan took the spoils of the city of Yericho, the spoils of the city of Jericho, his one act, one person, caused us to lose a battle, caused people to die. It was a tremendous thing, right? Ve'al kol hadat Yisrael haya katzif. On all of the Jewish people, there was anger from God. We didn't get only one person punished. Vehu ish echad ve'lo gava ba'avono. He was one person who didn't die from his own sin. We all took it on the chin as a result of that. So the Jewish people here have a passionate plea to the tribes of Reuben and Gad not to do this, not to break off, because it's going to impact them. You can come back or you can follow the guidelines, but you can't break off. You can't start something else. It's going to impact and affect all of us negatively. Now we could see how intense this drama is over here. And similar to the way that Moshe launched out a tirade against the Reuben and Gad when they first asked to go back to the land of the eastern side of the Jordan, it seems as though the Jews are doing the same thing again, right? This time it's not one person, it's a cohort of people being sent on behalf of the entire Jewish people. But once again, something is done by Reuben and Gad, which the motives of which are not 100% clear, but they seem to be pretty clear in the eyes of Moshe in the first case, and now in the eyes of the rest of the Jewish people. And so they think they understand what's going on over here, and they really go hard at the tribes of Reuben and Gad. They really criticize them. And once again, the tribes of Reuben and Gad express to them that we're being misunderstood. We're being misunderstood for what we're doing. We're not interested in reneging on our plot in the eastern side of the Jordan. We're very comfortable with our decision. We know what it is that we're doing, but you're misunderstanding what it is that we're doing. And so they come to now explain their actions. I just wanted to point that out, that you see the parallels between these stories, right? You see the tribe of Reuben hesitate when it comes to their actions. You see the way Moshe is not sure how to relate to them, but offers a harsh critique. And then now they have to go back and re-explain what it is that their intentions are, what their motivations are, and how they're going to conduct themselves properly. Let's take a look a little bit further here in this chapter, and then we're going to try to wrap up some of these lessons and ideas. I know we're reading a lot from the text here, but the text is so dramatic and it's so beautiful. And then we're going to really bring all of the lessons home together. Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, they answer them back. First, they say, you got us all wrong. El Elohim Adonai, El Elohim Adonai. God, God, the Lord our God, 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 the Lord our God. They're almost like Hashem Melech, Hashem Malach, similar to what we have, right? They make a passionate claim to not be going away from the path of God. Hu Yodea, he knows. V'Yisrael hu Yeda, and the Jewish people will know. Im bemered v'im bema'al b'Adonai. We intend no rebellion or treachery against God. Al toshi'enu hayom hazeh. And if we did, God would not save us. He would not spare us. Livnot lanu mizbeach lashuv me'acharei Adonai. Building the mizbeach to return from God is not our intention. V'im leha'alot alav olah u'mincha. And if our intention was to give sacrifices on it, v'im la'asot alav zivchei shanamim, and to give other kinds of offerings, it's not our intention. Adonai hu yivakesh. It is God. Let God require it. In other words, if that was our real intention, God will handle it. But it's not. Pasuk 24. We didn't do any of this to try to uproot God or rebel against God. We were worried about something, says the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh. We're worried, machar yomru benechem levanenu nemor. We're worried that tomorrow or sometime down the road, your children are going to say to our children, malachem veladonai Elohei Israel. What portion do you have in the nation of God? In other words, the tribes that lived in the land of Israel, at a certain point, they will break the tribes of Reuben and Gad off of the Jewish people. They're going to excommunicate them. They're going to say, who are you? What claim do you have to Torah and mitzvot? What claim do you have to be from the people of God? Not to mention, God put a natural border, a barrier between us. What do you think the Jordan River is here? The Jordan is a barrier between us. It's to keep you guys separate from us. You're a different people than us. This is what Reuben and Gad are worried that will be said about them. You have no portion in God. And your children will put our children, they'll cast us aside to not have any fear in God and to not be a part of God's nation. So what did we say? So we said we're going to build an altar not to actually give sacrifices on it. That's not our intention. Instead, it's going to simply be a dormant altar which connects the two people on both sides of the Jordan River. It is a testimony between us, and to our generations after us, to continue to serve and to do the will of God. If anything, it's the opposite, they say. It's supposed to be a testimony that we need to go to your side of the Jordan River to go ahead and give altar and to give sacrifices. It's an altar that we all know cannot be used. We need to go, to you in order to be able to serve God. Your children won't say to our children, so you see the concern of Reuben and Gad themselves. You could see that they're worried about what's going to be in the future. That Al-Bag points out a nice lesson from here. He says that this is the idea of foresight. Hacham enav berosho. That someone who's wise sees the future. Reuven and Gad see the future. Right now, they just got finished with the conquest of 14 years, settling the land. There's no concern that right now the Jews in the land of Israel are going to separate themselves from the Jews outside of the land of Israel. Right now, that's not a concern. But down the road, decades, centuries later, they're certainly worried about that possibility. That Al-Bag says you got to see the future. You can't just leave something that could become a problem. You have to deal with it right now. Not to get too political about something, but for those people who have the science of climate change, there's a problem going on right now. We have to think about solutions now, not in the future, because it'll be too late eventually. The tribes of Reuven and Gad see a problem that will exist in the future, and even though it doesn't exist now, they don't say, well, it's not a problem now, so we'll worry about it when it becomes. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, as is the famous saying. Sometimes you can't just wait to cross that bridge till you come to it, because once you get to the bridge, it's uncrossable. You waited to get to that point, and now there's nothing you could do about it. Sometimes you have to put in institutions and things in place that can protect you about where you're going to get there. And that's what Reuven and Gad try to do. And it's accepted. It's accepted by the rest of the people. Verses 30 till the end, Vayishma Pinchas HaKohen. They hear what it is. They say it's not a rebellion. We know what your intentions are. And they say, Vayitav hadavar be'enei bnei Israel. It was good in the eyes of the Jewish people. Vayvarechu Elohim et bnei Israel. They bless the Jewish people and God. Velo amru la'alot alehem latzava. They don't go and attack them. We avoid catastrophe. We avoid the potential civil war that could have killed hundreds of thousands of Jews at the hands of other Jews. But this is because the Reuven and Gad foresaw a problem that they hoped to stave off for the future. So one lesson that we can learn from Reuven and Gad is to think ahead, to not wait till you get to the bridge to cross it, because sometimes the circumstances might make it uncrossable if we wait that long. One thing else that's important to notice here as we talk about some of the lessons from this chapter, I want to talk about two other major points. One point is you see the regret in some of the comments of Reuven and Gad. You can see that they are nervous about their decision. They've made a decision, and they're sticking by their decision to stay on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Despite being given another opening to renege and come back, they continue to hold firm to their original decision that they want to live on the eastern side of the Jordan River because of the monetary benefits that it has to offer them. But you could see that they are scared. You could see that they are nervous. Their building an altar is a desperate plea, a desperate attempt at trying to maintain a connection between the two sides of the Jordan River, between the Jewish people. And they are unable to sort of get out of their own way. And that's what I want to talk about for a moment. Remember we said at the beginning of this class that there was a hesitation on the part of the tribe of Reuven and Gad to go to Moshe and tell them what they wanted. They originally winked at it. Oh, well, Moshe, this is good area for cattle, and we have a lot of cattle. Hint, hint. And Moshe doesn't say anything. And so they have to go to Moshe and they say, okay, Moshe, we want this land. Give us this land. Don't take us in. And that's when Moshe launches back at them. But why did it take them so long? Why were they hesitant to tell Moshe about their wants? It's because even then they were reserved about their decision. Even then they understood what they were choosing. They were choosing monetary success and comfort on a materialistic level versus spirituality in the land of Eretz Israel. They knew what they were choosing. They understood the consequences and the ramifications of their decision. They were also probably embarrassed to mention to Moshe this idea, how intent they were on their materialism. But it comes through nevertheless. I want to show you here on the source sheet in front of you. This is the source sheet that I built for this chapter. Take a look at these two pisukim. Here's Bamidbar, chapter 32, verse 16. This is the tribe of Reuven and Gad telling Moshe their plan. It says, Vayigeshu elav vayomru. They approached Moshe now. Again, I'm rewinding back to the Torah. I hope nobody's getting confused here. We're going back to the Torah because I'm trying to give you insight into what Reuven and Gad were thinking when they first made the decision and how that still resonates with them today. What were they thinking? Vayigeshu elav vayomru. They say to Moshe, Gidrot son nivnei lemiknenu po. We will build pens, sheepfolds for our cattle. Ve'arim letapenu, and cities for our children. Notice their priorities. They first put in the pens for their cattle. They're going to set their cattle up, and then they're going to set up their children with cities. Moshe hears this. And so, without intending it, I would say this was pretty unintentional. You see the priorities of Reuven and Gad come out. Their true colors come out. They're nervous in the beginning to show Moshe that that's what they're choosing. They know that that's what they're choosing, but they're hesitant. They try to hide it a little bit. Eventually, they have to tell Moshe. And then in the course of the conversation, their true colors really come out subconsciously. They say, let's build for our cattle and then for our children. And what does Moshe respond to them about 8 verses later? Look what he says. Moshe's wisdom is amazing. And he does it in such a hinted way, inconspicuously. He tells the tribes, okay, you could stay on the other side, but guess what? Benu lachem arim letapechem. Build cities for your children. Ugderot letzona'achem. And then sheepfolds for your flock. Moshe reverses the order. Moshe tells them, you guys have your priorities messed up. The whole request that you're saying over here is a lack of prioritization on your part. I'm not going to outwardly tell this to you. You guys have free will. You want to make this decision? If God agrees, it's up to you. Moshe does not intervene. He does not berate them. As long as they're not causing damage to the rest of the Jewish people, as long as they're not rebelling against God in an outward way, as long as they're willing to help their brothers, there's really nothing Moshe can do. He kind of throws his hands up and says, if this is where you want to live and Hashem let us conquer it for a reason, go ahead, you could take it. But understand your priorities and what you're choosing and understand the ramifications that will happen as a result of this. Rashi points this out, and I'll read it in English to save us some time. Rashi says they paid more regard to their property than their sons and daughters because they mentioned their cattle before their children. Moshe said to them, not so. Make the chief thing, and what is subordinate, subordinate. First build cities for your little ones, and afterwards enclosures for your flocks. Moshe makes this point to them, and it's highlighted by Rashi in this little switch that happens. Now, like we said, Reuben and Gad stay their course. They continue to push forward. They choose the materialism of the eastern side of the Jordan River. That's not to say that they're not spiritual, that they don't want to be part of Bnei Israel. Clearly, they want to be part of Bnei Israel, but they are not willing to forego on the materialism for the sake of living in the land of Israel multiple times. The first time they offered it and Moshe didn't really respond. The second time when Moshe gave them their criticism. And now all the way here in chapter 22 of Yehoshua, the Jews outwardly give them an opportunity. If your land is unclean, if it's tameh, come live with us. And they still maintain that they want to live on the other side of the Jordan River. They try to build this altar as a way of creating the connection. Moshe tries to split up the tribe of Menashe half and half on one side of the Jordan and one on the other side of the Jordan to keep a connection. There's all these strategies to try to keep a connection. But ultimately, when you don't live in close proximity and you're not in the land of Israel, there's only so much you can do to soak up from the holiness of the land of Israel. And this is something that pains me to say, because after all, I would assume everybody, unless Patty Baum is on here, which I think she is, right? And she's probably the only one who can claim she lives in Israel. But for all of us who live here in America, right, it pains us to say, no matter how much we support Israel, no matter how much we donate money, no matter how much we think about it and we vote politically for Israel, we could do a lot. And I'm not in the slightest bit demeaning that which we do. But nothing can compare to the connection of actually living in proximity with the people in Eretz Yisrael. And Reuven and Gad learned that painful message. They already anticipated it when they were going home outside of the land of Israel, and they're right there. They're just a quick go off of the Jordan River. But the bottom line is that natural boundary between the two of them, that split, they know, they're nervous about it, and it ends up proving to be a divider between them. How much more so is the Atlantic Ocean for us a divider? No matter how much we have in terms of connection, nothing can replace actually being there and living in the land of Israel. Will always remain a disconnect for as long as we continue to live in the Galut. And at the risk of painting a very dire picture, I'd like to read to you, or show you at least, this midrash in Bamidbar Rabbah. I want to read this to you and then end on one positive message, hopefully to finish the whole thing off. So I know I'm going already at 1:05, but we're just going to wrap up for another 5 minutes. I'll read it in English to save us time. In Bamidbar Rabbah, chapter 22, Midrash 7, it tells us about the fate that Reuven and Gad experience as a result of living outside of Israel. It says, our masters taught, two wise men arose in the world, one from Israel, one from the nations of the world. Achitophel was from Israel, while Bil'am was from the nations of the world, but both of them were lost from the world. No matter how wise you are, if you don't follow the ways of God, you could be lost from the world, as in Achitophel, who was from the Jews, and Bil'am, who was from the other nations. Two strong men arose in the world. One was from Israel, and one was from the nations of the world. Shimshon, Samson, was from Israel, while Goliath was from the nations of the world. But both of them were lost from the world. Over here, we have two strong people who, one from Israel, one not, who rely too much on their strength, who are a little arrogant about their strength. Both are lost. Two wealthy men arose in the world, Korah from Israel and Haman from the nations of the world. But both of them were lost from the world. Why are all these people being lost? Some from Israel, some from the nations of the world. Strength, wealth, wisdom. Why are they being lost? Why? Because their gift was not from the Holy One, blessed be He. They didn't get their gift from Hashem. They took it from themselves. Rather, they grabbed it up for themselves. Haman tries to make a money grab. Korah tries to make a power grab. Shimshon tries to make a power grab and tries to rely on himself. Bilaam thinks he's all wise. These are people who think they can combat God and go against God and not follow the ways of God. And they're sadly mistaken. Now here comes the last point. He says, so also you find with the children of Gad and the children of Reuben, that they were very wealthy and had a lot of livestock, but they loved their money and resided outside the land of Israel as a result. For that reason, they were the first of the tribes to go into exile. Reuben and Gad's fate as living outside of Israel was that they were exiled before anybody else. That lack of connection was just too much for them to maintain. As stated, and he carried them into exile, i.e. the Reubenites and the Gadites. Who brought the exile upon them? It happened because they had separated themselves from their siblings for the sake of their livestock. And where is it shown? From what is written in the Torah, now the children of Reuben and the children of Gad had much livestock. It's a sad lesson, but it's a lesson that's very powerful for us to learn. You cannot maintain a relationship of the highest caliber with the highest levels of holiness being separated from your Jewish brothers and sisters. One has to be united. We have to be together. We have to live in Eretz Yisrael. We have to grab on to any experience that we can for spirituality and piety in the land of Israel as much as possible. And there's no replacement for that. We could try to rationalize it for ourselves all we want. And I'm not saying that those rationalizations are not valid. Our excuses, quote unquote, for not living in Israel are valid. Nobody's denying that. I'm in the same boat myself. I have a community. We have businesses. We have schools. There's no question about it. We're all struggling and grappling with this. But we should never tell ourselves and rationalize it away to the point where we can be okay without it. We should never succumb to what Reuben and Gad said, which is, we'll be okay. Well, we'll do this, we'll do that, we'll do this, we'll do that, we'll build an altar with it, it'll all be okay. We can never, ever stop telling ourselves the message that at some point we need to rejoin with our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael, that there is something we cannot get over here that we can get over there. And at some point that's going to come to a head. And so we have to just recognize that. We have to be real about it. We have to be honest about it. And it might hurt us. It might make us feel uncomfortable. We might not like it to be said, but it's something that we have to keep, because the moment we don't understand it, the moment we lose sight of it, that's the moment we perish, as the Reuben and Gad themselves unfortunately experienced. Another lesson of Reuben and Gad is prioritization, knowing what's important to us. And this is something we can do all over the world, making sure that our money is not the top priority for us in our lives, but our children, our education, our community, the way we treat others, our chesed, our Torah, observance, our mitzvot, all of that needs to be at the forefront. And our money needs to help support that. And we definitely need to make a living, of course. And that's what allows us to do many of the things that we can do. But when it comes to a head, we must make sure that our priorities are set straight, because when they're not, again, we suffer from the error of Reuben and Gad. So far, we talked about a few lessons, and I want to wrap up with one more. So far, we talked about priorities. We talked about the importance of Eretz Yisrael. We talked about thinking ahead for the future and making sure that we can learn a positive thing from Reuben and Gad, that at least they were able to extend themselves as far as they could go because they were willing to think ahead about what they could potentially accomplish without waiting till the point of no return came. I'd like to close with one uplifting point with this in this chapter. That's something that the Ralbag mentions. The Ralbag is Rabbi Levi ben Gershon, otherwise known as Gersonides. He has a commentary in the book of Yehoshua, and at the very end of the book, which we'll go through ourselves one at a time, he brings a whole host of lessons that you can learn from the entire book of Yehoshua. And I wanted to just pick one of them out. We'll go through all of them as we bring the book of Yehoshua to a close, but I thought it would be worthwhile to bring this one at our chapter. And that is the importance of hearing each other out, of talking to each other, of having dialogue between Jew to Jew even when we might not think that we're on agreement on the same playing field. He writes the following. I'll read it in English to save us some time. The 8th lesson is what we learned about dispatching Pinchas and the tribal princes to the Transjordan to investigate the truth of the matter before waging war. This teaches that even in drastic matters which must be swiftly acted upon, one must still deliberate and investigate the matter. Behold, if not for the investigation, it would have led to a catastrophe if the army got involved against its brothers. One may have thought that no delay should occur on such matters which are opposed to God for the conclusions which Pinchas and the princes reached. We find that Pinchas did not delay to take advice from Moshe in the matter of Zimri, for our rabbis taught, anytime there is a desecration of God's name, we do not give honor to the rabbi. In other words, that Al-Bag says, there's a very powerful message in the fact that the Jewish people dispatched Pinchas and Elazar and a cohort to find out what was going on in Reuben and Gad. Typically in matters like this, where you think there's a desecration of God's name, people are rebelling against God, our first impulse is to attack, to berate, to go against, and to fight physically. And unfortunately, we will see many episodes as we continue our study of Navi where this wasn't the case, where the Jews jumped to conclusions and acted with bloodshed, and it caused devastating consequences for the Jewish people. Here, however, devastation and catastrophe is staved off because the Jews are willing to talk to each other, because they send a cohort to investigate the situation, to have a conversation with Reuben and Gad, to hear them out, to tell them their concerns, and to severely express how they're feeling, but then to listen to what the Jews had to say, to listen to what these other tribes had to say, what their reasoning was, what their rationale was. And then what happens? We stave off devastation. We have peace amongst Am Yisrael. It's a lesson as old as time, which is that we have to listen to each other. When there are concerns, when there are disagreements, when we're worried about the way others are conducting themselves, we can express those concerns, but we cannot simply act in a zealous way to attack others and to hurt others. That's how we create disunity in Am Yisrael. When we take the time to ask questions, to have dialogue, to express our concerns to others, and then to listen to what they're saying, to where they're coming from, to their rationale. We may not always agree with it. I'm sure Pinchas and Elazar went back and said, I'm not so sure I agree with the decision of Reuben and Gad to live over there. I'm not so sure I agree that the Mizbeach is going to work. They maybe didn't agree, but they heard it out. And the rationale made sense to them. And if this is what they wanted to do, we'll give them the opportunity, as long as they're not causing a desecration of God's name. And that allowed the Jewish people to live peacefully, harmoniously, and to not engage in an act of war and bloodshed. And it saves hundreds of thousands of lives amongst the Jewish people. And more than that, it shows peace and connection between all of Am Yisrael. What's interesting is that Al-Bag says at the end that sometimes, we act too quickly. Pinchas himself, as I noted before, he acts without asking Moshe. He says, there's a desecration of God, I have to act, and he kills Zimri. But there was also one person. It was an act which was clear to everybody as day that there was a problem here. And it was one person. In the case of our chapter, it's a group of people, which once it's a group of people, you have to say, let me take a step back. There must be a reason behind it. It's a large group of people. They're not all crazy. And it's also not clear. It was an act. It wasn't something that they were doing publicly in a manner that was obvious what they were doing. And so Pinchas and the Nesim, the same Pinchas who killed Zimri, takes the time to talk. He takes the time to have dialogue. He takes the time to listen. And as a result, peace is created amongst the Jewish people. So I think this is a very important chapter. It's a chapter that when we analyze it from many different sides, we look at the Torah, what it had to say, we look at the connection here in Joshua chapter 22, we see so many different lessons about the behaviors of all the different people here. Some good, some bad. Some things we want to emulate, some things we want to correct. Looking to the future, having dialogue and peace, making sure that we have our priorities set straight, knowing what's important to us, and a love and connection with Eretz Yisrael and all Jews around the world, I think are some of the major themes that come out of this very interesting and very dramatic story. And hopefully we can take the positive lessons, apply them to our personal and communal lives to hopefully lead a better, more productive life and to see a better, more productive Am Yisrael. If there are any questions about the chapter or any of the lessons, I'm all ears. We'll open it up to questions. Otherwise, I thank everybody for listening.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Rini.
There was no pushback from that Chatzi Shevet Menashe to, like, they loved Eretz Yisrael so much and now they're just being put on the other side. There was nothing.
It's an interesting question. If we go with the idea that it was intentional by Moshe, we don't see any pushback on their part. It could be that these were people who maybe accepted it. Maybe they were even willing to volunteer once Moshe presented them the option. It's not 100% clear. They're also able to inhabit a much larger piece of land, and they have a connection with their brothers in Menashe as well. We don't see any pushback, which is maybe why some of the other commentaries are hesitant, like the Ramban, to explain that Moshe did this intentionally versus maybe it was a decision that Menashe and them came to sort of on their own as they were going about it. I would maybe next class I'll take a moment to read the Ramban inside. I didn't bring it up today and we didn't read it inside. I forget exactly his language over there. It might offer us some insight into the question that you're asking. But as far as the text is concerned, we don't see a pushback necessarily. We don't.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Rabbi, maybe they felt that they were doing a mitzvah or a chesed by dividing themselves, and they were doing it for the good of the whole Jewish nation. So they just were humble in that way, saying, you stay here, we'll go there. This way we could keep our family together.
That is definitely possible. That is possible, 100%. I saw a bit of an out-of-the-box approach to the people of Menashe being on that side of the Jordan River. It requires further analysis because I'm not sold on it myself. But some people say that the tribe of Menashe somehow, this is Professor Yoel Elitzur makes this claim, that somehow the people in the tribe of Menashe were living there even while the Jews were in Mitzrayim. I'm not sure how he makes this claim, but apparently he says that there was a group of Menashe people who were not in Egypt or maybe got out of Egypt earlier on before the Jews were enslaved and were living in that area in the Bashan already and sort of met up with the rest of the Jewish people when they got to that area. And that would mean that they were already living there from before, so it was only natural that they would stay there versus the rest of their brothers who would go into the land of Israel. It's a pretty bold interpretation. It requires more investigation on my part to see how the claims work, because I've never seen anybody say that there were groups of Jews who were not in Egypt and whole tribes that maybe were not in Egypt as slaves. It's a very, very strange and very, very odd thing. I would need to validate the claim a little bit more, but maybe that's another possibility that we could explore a little bit more. It's a strange one for me. I'm not ready to accept it just yet, personally. I mean, we could look at it another time. Yeah. Okay. Enjoy, everyone. Have a great day. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Very
Thank you,
enlightening.
Rabbi.
Patty's on. Patty's on.
Hi, Patty.
Come on, I was on. It was
Okay.
great.
All right, good.
Bye.
Enjoy. Take care.